The wind cut through Caleb's coat like a knife as he rode Dusty up the narrow trail toward the ranch that was now, at least on paper, his. A single silver dollar had sealed the deal at the county auction that morning, the papers still folded in his breast pocket. Folks had laughed when they saw him bid on the place, muttering about broken fences and a roof caved in by last winter's snow. But Caleb had seen the bones of a home in those weathered timbers, and he needed somewhere to start over. Dusty's ears twitched at every creak of ice in the pines, his breath puffing in quick clouds as they crested the ridge. The ranch lay below, silent under a thin crust of snow, the cabin's chimney dark. Caleb loosened the reins and nudged Dusty forward, but halfway to the cabin the stallion stopped dead. Caleb gave a gentle kick, then a firmer one. Dusty didn't move. Instead, he shifted his weight, pawed at the ground, and let out a low, uneasy whinny. Caleb frowned. Dusty was a steady old soul, not given to skittishness, but now his gaze was fixed on the cabin door, as if something inside was holding him rooted to the spot. Caleb swung down, boots crunching in the frost, and led him by the reins. Still, Dusty resisted, planting his hooves and tossing his head. "What is it, boy?" Caleb murmured, rubbing the stallion's neck. The wind died for a heartbeat, and in that silence he heard it, a faint sound muffled by wood and distance. He froze, tilting his head, the noise barely audible above the stillness, a slow, rhythmic clinking like metal on wood. His gut tightened. He left Dusty where he stood and strode up the porch steps, each one groaning under his weight. The door hung slightly ajar. Snow drifted in along the threshold. Caleb pushed it open with his gloved hand, and the smell hit him. Stale air, unwashed skin, and the sour tang of fear. His eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the grime-streaked windows, and then he saw her. In the far corner, a young woman sat on the floor, her back against the wall, hands bound in iron shackles bolted into the timber. Her face was pale, lips cracked, hair hanging in tangled ropes over her shoulders, and her belly swelled beneath a torn dress. She looked up at him with wide, hollow eyes, and the clinking came from the chain as she tried weakly to lift her hands. Caleb's heart thudded hard, a hot surge of anger and disbelief flooding his chest. Behind him, Dusty's hooves stamped on the porch, the stallion refusing to leave. Caleb's boots felt heavier with each step as he crossed the cramped cabin, his eyes never leaving the woman. She flinched when he knelt in front of her, a reflex born of too many blows. He lifted his hands slowly, showing her they were empty before resting them on the iron shackles. The metal was ice cold, biting his skin. "Who did this?" he asked quietly, but she only shook her head, her gaze darting towards the far wall. Caleb followed her eyes and noticed something odd. 3 deep gouges carved into the wood, spaced evenly like someone had dragged a knife in a slow, deliberate line. Above them was a blackened scorch mark, as if someone had pressed hot iron against the log. His jaw tightened. That was no accident. It was a warning. He glanced back at her swollen belly and the raw chafing around her wrists. She'd been here for days, maybe weeks, without anyone to help. From the way her dress hung loose except where her stomach stretched it, he guessed she hadn't eaten properly in some time. He stood, scanning the room. No food, no stove lit. Just a tipped-over chair, a broken cup on the floor, and a single blanket crumpled in the corner. The wind rattled the window shutters, and Dusty's hoofbeats thudded softly on the porch, as if urging him to hurry. Caleb's fingers curled around the shackle chain, testing its strength. Solid, bolted deep. It would take tools to get her free, but he wasn't leaving her another hour in this place. "I'll be back," he told her, but she reached out weakly, her fingers brushing his coat. "Don't," she whispered, her voice raspy. "They come back." Caleb stilled, his gut knotting. "When?" Her cracked lips formed the word soon. That was all it took to ignite the fire in his chest. Whoever they were, they'd chained a pregnant woman in an abandoned cabin in the dead of winter, and they were coming back for her. Caleb strode to the doorway, whistling sharply. Dusty stepped forward, ears pricked. From his saddlebag, Caleb pulled a small hatchet and a coil of rope. He set to work on the bolts, every blow ringing loud in the quiet. After the second strike, he noticed the woman's eyes widening, not at him, but at something behind him. Caleb turned, hand already going to the knife at his belt. Through the gap in the shutters, a shadow moved, tall, broad, carrying something long and gleaming. Then another shadow joined it. Caleb's pulse kicked hard. They weren't coming back. They were already here. The knock was not polite. It was the kind that rattled the loose door hinges and sent a small flurry of snow from the porch roof. Caleb froze, his fingers tightening around the knife hilt as the woman's breathing quickened. Dusty snorted outside, hooves scraping in agitation. Another pounding knock came, followed by a voice, deep, slurred, and brimming with authority that had never been earned. "We know you're in there, girl. Time to finish what we started." Caleb's jaw locked. He stepped quietly to the wall beside the door, positioning himself so he couldn't be seen through the gap. The woman shook her head desperately, mouthing something he didn't need to hear to understand. "Don't open it." The door creaked as the latch was tried from the other side, then rattled harder when it didn't give. Caleb shifted his weight, scanning the cabin for anything to use as a weapon. There was nothing but the hatchet in his hand and the knife on his belt. Outside, the second man's voice joined in, cruel laughter bubbling under his words. "That horse of yours?" "Pretty thing. We'll take him too." Dusty's answering squeal split the air, hooves striking the porch planks. Caleb risked a glance through the shutter crack and caught sight of them. Two men in worn coats, faces wind-burned and unshaven, rifles slung over their shoulders. One had a scar running from temple to jaw, puckered and white. The other was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. They didn't look like they'd come to talk. Caleb's blood ran hot. "You've got one chance to turn around and walk," he called through the door, his voice low but carrying. Silence fell for a heartbeat before the scarred man barked a laugh. "And leave the prize? You're crazier than they said." Caleb's grip on the hatchet tightened. "Last warning." The latch rattled again, harder this time, and the woman whimpered softly. Then the sound of metal scraping wood came, a knife tip working at the door seam. Caleb moved in one smooth motion, sliding the heavy iron poker from beside the cold stove and wedging it through the shackle chain at her wrists. One hard twist, and the wood bolts split, freeing her. "Stay behind me," he murmured. She stumbled to her feet, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Dusty let out a sharp, piercing neigh outside. Then the unmistakable thud of boots hitting the porch told Caleb their time was up. He stepped to the door, hatchet raised, just as the first hinge gave way. The men had come for a victim. What they found instead was someone ready to make them regret it. The door burst inward, splintering under the force, and the first man charged through with a rifle raised. Caleb didn't give him the chance to aim. He stepped into the swing of his own hatchet, the wooden handle cracking against the man's wrist. The rifle clattered to the floor as the man stumbled, clutching his arm, and Caleb drove his shoulder into him, sending them both crashing into the wall. The second man was already on the porch, but before he could step inside, Dusty lunged from the side, teeth sinking into the man's coat sleeve with a ferocity Caleb had never seen in him. The man swore, jerking back, but Dusty held on, hooves pounding the boards like war drums. Caleb shoved the first attacker aside, the hatchet in his hand now reversed so the blunt end struck hard into the man's temple. He crumpled to the floor, groaning. The woman had retreated to the far corner, clutching her blanket tight, but her eyes were locked on Caleb, wide with something like disbelief. No one had ever fought for her before. The second man finally tore free of Dusty's grip and swung the butt of his rifle toward the horse's head, but Caleb was already moving. He grabbed the rifle barrel mid-swing and yanked, sending the man sprawling across the porch steps. Caleb followed, planting a boot in the man's chest to keep him down. The man spat blood, his breath ragged in the cold. "She ain't yours," he growled, eyes darting toward the woman inside. Caleb's voice was low, dangerous. "She's not yours either, and she's not going anywhere with you." He brought the hatchet down, not to kill, but to bury the blade into the porch rail beside the man's head, the wood splintering inches from his ear. The message was clear. Dusty stood just behind Caleb, nostrils flaring, still trembling with the leftover surge of the fight. The other man inside groaned again, starting to push himself up, but Caleb turned sharply and leveled the rifle he'd taken from the second man. "Stay down," he warned. Silence settled for a moment, except for the wind in the pines and Dusty's heavy breathing. Caleb's heart pounded, but his mind was already turning. This wasn't over. These two were just the hands of someone else, someone who thought they could send men to drag her back without consequence. Caleb knew better. He stepped inside, shut the busted door as best he could, and looked at the woman. "We're leaving," he said, because staying meant they'd both be dead by morning. Caleb didn't wait for her answer. He grabbed a worn saddlebag from the wall, slung it over his shoulder, and motioned for her to follow. Dusty was already dancing in the snow, sensing urgency. The woman hesitated only long enough to glance back at the wrecked cabin before stepping into the cold, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Caleb lifted her onto Dusty's back, as if she weighed nothing, his big hands steady despite the rush in his movements. He swung up behind her, pulling her close so she wouldn't fall when the horse moved. A sharp whistle sent Dusty lunging forward, hooves cutting into the crusted snow. Behind them, the sound of shouts rose. The two men had recovered enough to realize they were losing their prize. Caleb didn't look back. He guided Dusty into the thick stand of pines where the snow fell heavier, muffling sound and hiding their trail from the open. The woman's breathing was shallow, each exhale clouding the air, but she didn't complain. Caleb could feel the tremor in her body, not just from the cold, but from everything that had just happened. The forest closed around them, the pines creaking under the weight of snow. Caleb's eyes swept the shadows, scanning for movement. He knew these mountains. The men chasing them didn't. If he could get them to the old hunting cabin by the creek, they'd have shelter and enough distance to regroup. But the path was narrow, and Dusty's pace had to slow to keep from breaking a leg in the hidden drifts. A crow burst from the branches overhead, its harsh caw echoing like a warning. Caleb's grip on the reins tightened. "We need to move faster," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her. She twisted slightly to look at him, her lips pale. "They won't stop," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of certainty. Caleb's jaw clenched. "Neither will I." The creek was close now. He could hear the faint rush of water under the ice, but so too came the sound of snapping branches behind them, too deliberate to be the wind. Caleb's stomach dropped. The men were on horseback, following their trail despite the snow. He urged Dusty into a careful but faster trot, weaving between the trees. The woman clung to him, her head turning to glance behind them. Then, through the trees ahead, Caleb saw it. The dark outline of the hunting cabin, roof sagging under years of neglect. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and maybe just enough to give them an edge before the fight caught up to them again. Caleb slid from Dusty's back before the horse had even stopped moving, his boots sinking deep into the snow. He pulled the woman down with surprising gentleness, steadying her on her feet before leading her quickly toward the cabin. The door was stiff, swollen from years of storms, but one hard shove sent it creaking inward. Inside, it was dim and cold, the air stale with the scent of old pine and dust. Caleb guided her in and shut the door behind them, latching it with the single rusted bar that remained. Dusty stood outside, his ears pricked, shifting restlessly as if he, too, could feel the danger close. Caleb moved quickly, scanning the room, a broken table, a stone hearth with ashes long dead, and a pile of dry wood in the corner that looked usable. He had just dropped his saddlebag on the table when Dusty's low, throaty whinny broke the silence. Caleb froze. The woman's eyes darted toward the door, her hands gripping the blanket tighter. He stepped to the narrow window, brushing frost from the glass. Through the shifting curtain of snow he saw movement. Dark shapes gliding between the pines, too large to be deer, too quiet to be harmless. The men had found them. Caleb turned back to her, his voice low but sharp. "Stay away from the door, and if I tell you to hide, you do it." She nodded, though fear had tightened her features, her lips trembling. Outside, Dusty stamped the snow, his breath steaming in the air, eyes fixed on something beyond Caleb's line of sight. A shadow fell across the doorway, followed by the faint crunch of snow under boots. Caleb gripped the handle of his hatchet, every muscle coiled. The latch rattled once. Testing. Then again, harder this time. Caleb stepped silently to the side of the door, pressing himself against the wall so he'd be out of sight if it swung open. The rattling stopped. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the sound of wind. Then a voice came through, muffled but clear enough. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you, mountain man. Hand her over, and we might let you walk away." Caleb didn't answer. His eyes flicked to the window just in time to catch another shadow moving toward the back wall of the cabin. They were trying to surround him. He took a slow breath, lowering his center of gravity, and readied himself for the moment when the door, or the wall itself, would give. This was going to be close. Caleb didn't wait for the men to make the first move. Years in the mountains had taught him that hesitation could get you killed, and these men weren't here to talk. He crossed the cabin in 2 silent strides, grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the wall, and slid the window shutter open just enough to fit the barrel through. The woman watched him from the corner, her breath shallow, her eyes darting between the door and the back wall. Outside, the snow muffled most sounds, but Caleb could hear the faint crunch of boots circling to flank him. He spotted a shape moving through the pines, a flash of brown coat, a glint of steel. Caleb took aim, squeezed the trigger, and the rifle's crack shattered the stillness, sending a raven exploding from the treetops. The man went down hard, disappearing into the snow. There was no time to see if he'd stay there. Another shadow darted toward Dusty, and the stallion reared, lashing out with his hooves, buying Caleb precious seconds. Caleb ducked back from the window as a bullet slammed into the wall where his head had been. Splinters showered his arm, stinging his skin. The woman flinched but didn't scream, pressing herself tighter into the corner as Caleb moved to the door. He unlatched it slowly, his eyes on the ground to catch the shift of shadows under the crack. When the next set of footsteps approached, he swung the door open in a single motion, using its weight to slam into the man on the other side. The man stumbled back with a curse, and Caleb was on him, driving the butt of his rifle into his ribs before yanking him forward and throwing him into the snow. Another attacker charged from the side, and Caleb pivoted, letting the momentum carry the man past him before he swept his leg out and dropped him face first into the drift. Dusty screamed a warning, his ears flat and nostrils flaring. More were coming. Caleb kicked the door shut and dropped the bar back into place, his chest heaving. Outside, voices rose in anger, their words snatched by the wind, but their intent was clear. They would burn the cabin down if they couldn't get in. Caleb's mind raced. He had to get her out before the fire started, but the only way was straight through the men who wanted her. He glanced at her, his expression unyielding. "When I open that door again," he said, "we run." No matter what happens, Caleb didn't give her time to answer. He slung the rifle across his back, grabbed the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and kicked the door open so hard it slammed into the wall. The sudden burst of light and cold blinded them both for a heartbeat. But Caleb was already moving, pulling her into the snow. Dusty was waiting, muscles bunched, breath steaming, eyes locked on the movement ahead. Caleb hoisted her into the saddle with a strength that didn't waver despite the chaos, then swung up behind her. The shouts came instantly, 2 men breaking from the tree line, one raising his pistol. Caleb spurred Dusty hard, the stallion leaping forward like a creature born from the wind, snow spraying in glittering arcs beneath his hooves. The first shot whined past Caleb's ear, the second thudded into the snow just behind them. He leaned low, urging Dusty toward a narrow gap between the pines. The path was little more than a deer trail, winding and uneven, but it offered cover. Branches clawed at their coats, snow falling in sudden bursts from the trees, and the sound of pursuit grew fainter with each stride. But the storm was building again, wind tearing through the forest in howling gusts. Caleb's jaw clenched. Visibility was dropping, and fast. Behind him, faint shapes still moved between the trees, slower now but relentless. Dusty's ears flicked back, his powerful strides never faltering, though Caleb could feel the stallion's breathing deepen with the effort. The woman clung to the saddle horn, her knuckles white, but she didn't make a sound. Her silence spoke of someone who knew that noise could mean death. They broke from the trees into a wide meadow, the snow knee-deep and unbroken. The wind was worse here, screaming across the open ground, and Caleb knew the meadow was a risk. They'd be exposed. But somewhere on the other side was the frozen creek, and beyond that, a rocky overhang that could serve as shelter. He urged Dusty forward, each stride heavy in the deep powder. Midway across, another shot rang out from the tree line. Caleb twisted in the saddle, firing a single round back, more to keep their pursuers cautious than to hit. The shadowy figures slowed, giving them the space they needed. By the time they reached the far trees, Caleb's legs were burning from holding himself steady against the stallion's surging power. Dusty plunged into the cover of the pines, and the wind eased, but the danger hadn't passed. They still had to vanish before the men circled to cut them off. Caleb leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Hold on. We're not safe yet." Caleb didn't slow once they reached the cover of the pines. He guided Dusty in a wide arc, moving deeper into the forest where the snow lay untouched and silence pressed in like a shroud. The woman glanced over her shoulder, her breath hitching when she caught glimpses of dark figures fanning out at the meadow's edge. They were trying to guess his path. Caleb already knew what they'd do next. They'd push him toward the ridge, trap him against the drop. He had no intention of letting that happen. Pulling on the reins, he slid from the saddle, landing softly in the snow. "Stay on him," he told her, his voice low but edged with command. She hesitated, but the look in his eyes left no room for argument. Caleb led Dusty into a shallow depression between 2 rises, then gave the stallion a soft pat before disappearing into the trees alone, moving like a shadow among shadows. Every step was deliberate, weight spread so the snow made almost no sound. Ahead, he saw one of the men creeping through the underbrush, his rifle ready, scanning for movement. Caleb waited until the man stepped past a fallen log, then lunged, catching him around the throat and dragging him silently into the drift. The man thrashed once before going still. Caleb took his pistol and slid away again. Another voice called out, a question to the downed man, but Caleb's reply was the sharp crack of a branch underfoot in the opposite direction, drawing the next pursuer away from Dusty's hiding place. The wind shifted, bringing with it the faint sound of hoofbeats. The others were trying to circle. Caleb's jaw tightened. He slipped through the trees until he could see the meadow again. 2 more men were crossing, their attention fixed on the tree line where they thought he'd emerge. He raised the rifle, steadied his breathing, and fired twice. One man dropped instantly. The other dove for cover. Caleb didn't wait. He turned and sprinted back toward Dusty. The woman's eyes widened as he appeared from between the trees, snow in his beard and the hard glint of survival in his gaze. "We've got a gap," he said, swinging into the saddle behind her. "We take it now, or we don't get another." Dusty surged forward again, his breath coming in steaming bursts as they veered away from the ridge and down toward the frozen creek. Behind them, shouts rang out, but none were close enough to stop them. Caleb's plan had worked. He'd turned the hunt into chaos. All that was left was to reach the overhang before the storm swallowed the world entirely. By the time they reached the frozen creek, the storm had closed in so thick it was like riding through a world made of swirling white. Dusty's hooves cracked the ice in shallow spots, but Caleb kept him steady, guiding him toward the jagged silhouette of the overhang ahead. When they reached it, the stallion slipped beneath the rocky lip, sides heaving, steam rising off his coat. Caleb slid down first, then helped her dismount, his hands firm but careful as though she were made of glass. The wind roared just beyond their shelter, hurling icy pellets that hissed against the rock. But here there was stillness, broken only by Dusty's heavy breathing. Caleb dropped his pack, pulling out a rolled blanket and the small pouch of dried meat he'd saved. He gave the blanket to her first, wrapping it snugly around her shoulders, then handed her the food. She tried to speak, but her voice caught. Too many hours of cold and fear had stripped the words away. Caleb knelt beside her, lighting a small fire against the rock wall with quick, practiced hands, shielding the flame from the wind. The glow flickered over his face, softening the hard lines, and she found herself staring at the man they'd all called dangerous. There was danger in him, yes, but it was the kind that guarded rather than destroyed. Outside, the snow piled higher, sealing them in a cocoon of silence. Caleb glanced at her once the fire caught, his voice low but steady. "You're safe now." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't just a statement, it was a vow. She felt the weight of it, the truth in it, and for the first time since the beating, her body began to unclench. Dusty stepped closer, lowering his head to nuzzle her arm as though offering comfort of his own. She let her hand rest against the stallion's warm muzzle, and a tear slipped down her cheek. Not from pain, but from the sudden, overwhelming sense of being seen. Caleb leaned back against the rock, his rifle within reach, eyes still scanning the white world beyond. He would keep watch until the storm passed. She understood then that whatever strange fate had brought his injured wolf to her door, whatever cruel joke had set tongues wagging about him in town, it had led to this: shelter, safety, and the quiet promise in a mountain man's gaze. Outside, the wind howled like a warning, but inside the overhang, warmth began to seep back into her bones. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew this: she would not face it alone.